Farmer Boy, Chapter 18, Keeping House. Uncle Andrew lived 10 miles away. For a week, Father and Mother were getting ready to go, and all the time they were thinking of all the things that must be done when they were away. Even when Mother was climbing into the buggy, she was talking. "Be sure to gather the eggs every night," she said, "and I depend on you, Eliza Jane, to take care of the churning. Don't salt the butter too much. Pack it in the small tub, and be sure you cover it. And remember not to pick the beans and peas that I'm saving for seed. Now, you all be good while we're gone." She was tucking her hoops down between the seat and the dashboard. Father spread the lap robe. "And mind, Eliza Jane, you be careful of fires, and don't you leave the house while there's fire in the cook stove. And don't get to scuffing with that lighted candles. Whatever you do," and Father tightened the reins and the horses started. "Don't eat all the sugar," Mother called back, and the buggy turned to the road. The horses began to trot rapidly, taking Father and Mother away. In a little while, the sound of the buggy wheels ceased. Father and Mother were gone. Nobody said anything. Even Eliza Jane looked a little scared. The house and the barns and the field seemed very big and empty. For a whole week, Father and Mother would be miles away. Suddenly, Almanzo threw his hat in the air and yelled. Alice hugged herself and cried, "What do we do first?" They could do anything they liked. There was nobody to stop them. "We'll do the dishes and make the beds," Eliza Jane said, bossy. "Let's make ice cream," Royal shouted. Eliza Jane loved ice cream. She hesitated and said, "Well..." Almanzo ran after Royal to the ice house, and they dug a block of ice out of the sawdust and put it in a grain sack. They laid the sack on the back porch and pounded it with hatchets until the ice was crushed. Alice came out to watch, and then she whipped egg whites on a platter. She beat them with a fork till they were too stiff to slip. And when she tilted the platter, Eliza Jane measured the milk and the cream and dipped the sugar from the barrel into the pantry. It was not common maple sugar, but white sugar bought from the store, and Mother used it only when company came. Eliza Jane dipped 6 cupfuls, and then she smoothed the sugar that was left, so you could hardly have missed any of it. She made a big milk pail full of yellow custard. Then she set the pail in a tub and packed the snowy, crushed ice around it. With salt, they covered it all with a blanket. Every few minutes, they took off the blanket and uncovered the pail and stirred the freezing ice cream. When it was frozen, Alice brought saucers and spoons, and Almanzo brought out a cake and the butcher knife. He cut enormous pieces of cake, while Eliza Jane heaped the saucers. They could eat all the ice cream and cake they wanted to. No one would stop them. At noon, they had eaten the whole cake and almost all the ice cream. Eliza Jane said it was time to get dinner, but the others didn't want any dinner. Almanzo said, "All I want is watermelon." Eliza Jane jumped up. "Goody! Let's go get one." "Alice," Eliza Jane cried, "you come right back here and do the breakfast dishes." "I will," Alice called out, "when I come back." Alice and Almanzo went into the hot melon field where the melons lay round above their wilting flat leaves. Almanzo snapped his finger against the green rinds and listened. When a melon sounded ripe, it was ripe, and when it sounded green, it was green. But when Almanzo said a melon sounded ripe, Alice thought it sounded green. There wasn't really any way to know, though Almanzo was sure he knew more about melons than any girl. And so in the end, they picked 6 of the biggest melons, and they lugged them one by one to the ice house and put them on the damp, cold sawdust. Then Alice went to the house to do the dishes. Almanzo said he wasn't going to do anything, maybe go swimming. But as soon as Alice was out of sight, he skipped through the barns and stole to the pasture where the colts were. The pasture was big, and the sun was very hot. The air shimmered and waved with heat, and little insects made a shrill sound. Bess and Beauty were laying down in the shade of a tree. Their little colts stood near them, wagging their small bushy tails, straddling on their little long gangling legs. The yearlings and the 2-year-olds and the 3-year-olds were grazing. All of them lifted their heads and stared at Almanzo. He went slowly toward them, holding out his hand. There wasn't anything in his hand, but they didn't know that. He didn't mean to do anything. He only wanted to get near enough to pet them. Starlight and the other colt ran wobbling to their mothers, and Bess and Beauty lifted their heads and looked, and then laid them down again. The big colts all pricked up their ears. One big colt stepped toward Almanzo and then another. The 6 big colts were all coming. Almanzo wished he had brought carrots for them. They were so beautiful and free and big, tossing their manes and showing the whites of their eyes. The sunshine glistened on their strong arched necks and on the muscles of their chests. Suddenly, one of them said, "Whoosh!" One of them kicked and one of them squealed, and all at once their heads went up and their tails went up and their hooves thundered on the ground, and all their brown haunches and high back tails were turned to Almanzo like a thundering whirlwind. Those 6 colts went around the tree, and Almanzo heard them behind him. He whirled around and he saw their pounding hooves and big chests coming straight at him. They were running too fast to stop. There wasn't time to get out of the way. Almanzo's eyes shut. He yelled, "Whoa!" And the air and the ground shook and his eyes opened. And he saw brown knees rising up in the air and a round belly and hind legs rushed overhead. Brown sides went by him like thunder and his hat flew off. He felt stunned. One of the 3-year-olds had jumped over him. The colts were thundering down across the pasture, and Almanzo saw Royal coming. "Leave those colts be," Royal shouted. He came up and he said for a cent he'd give Almanzo a licking that he'd remember. "You know better than to fool with those colts," Royal said, and he took Almanzo by the ear. Almanzo trotted, but his ear was pulled all the way to the barns. He said he hadn't done anything. Royal wouldn't listen. "Let me catch you in that pasture again, and I'll whale the hide off you," Royal said. "And I'll tell Father, too." Almanzo went away, rubbing his ear. He went down to Trout River and swam in the swimming hole until he felt better. But he thought it wasn't fair that he was the youngest in the family. That afternoon the melons were cold, and Almanzo carried them to the grass under the balsam tree in the yard. Royal stuck the butcher knife into the dewy green rinds, and every melon was so ripe that the rinds cracked open, and Almanzo and Alice and Eliza Jane and Royal bit deep into the juicy cold side slices. They ate until they could eat no more. Almanzo pinched the sleek black seeds, popping them at Eliza Jane until she made him quit. Then he slowly ate the last slice of melon, and he said, "I'm going to fetch Lucy to eat up the rinds. You will not do any such thing," Eliza Jane said. "The idea, a dirty old pig in the front yard." "She is not either a dirty old pig," said Almanzo. "Lucy's a little, young, clean pig. And pigs are the cleanest animals there are. You ought to see the way Lucy keeps her bed and cleans it and turns it and airs it and makes it up every day. Horses don't do that, nor cows, nor sheep, nor anything. Pigs—" "I guess I know that. I guess I know as much about pigs as you do," Eliza Jane said. "Then don't you call Lucy dirty. She's just as clean as you be." "Well, Mother told you to obey me," Eliza Jane answered, "and I'm not going to waste melon rinds on any pig. I'm going to make watermelon rind preserves. I guess they're as much my rinds as they are yours," Almanzo began. But Royal got up and said, "Come on, Manzo, it's chore time." Almanzo said no more, but when the chores were done, he let Lucy out of her pen. The little pig was as white as a lamb, and she liked Almanzo. Her little curled tail quirked whenever she saw him. She followed him to the house, grunting happily, and she squealed for him at the door until Eliza Jane said she couldn't hear herself think. After supper, Almanzo took a plate of scraps and fed them to Lucy. He sat on the back steps and scratched her prickly back. Pigs enjoy that. In the kitchen, Eliza Jane and Royal were arguing about candy. Royal wanted some, but Eliza Jane said that candy pulls were only for winter evenings. Royal said he didn't see why candy wouldn't be just as good in the summer. Almanzo thought so too, so he went in and sided with Royal. Alice said she knew how to make candy, and Eliza Jane wouldn't do it, but Alice mixed the sugar and molasses and water and boiled them, and then she poured the candy on the buttered platters and set it to the porch to cool. They rolled up their sleeves and buttered their hands, ready to pull it, and Eliza Jane buttered her hands too. All the time, Lucy was squealing for Almanzo. He went out to see if the candy was cool enough, and he thought his little pig should have some. The candy was cool, and no one was watching. So, he took a big wad of the brown candy and he dropped it over the edge of the porch into Lucy's wide open mouth. Then they all pulled candy, and they pulled it into long strands and doubled the strands and pulled again. Every time they doubled it, they took a bite. It was very sticky. It stuck to their teeth and their fingers and their faces, and somehow it got in their hair and stuck when Almanzo dropped some on the floor. It stuck there. It should have become hard and brittle, but it didn't. They pulled and pulled. Still, it was soft and sticky. Long past bedtime, they gave up and went to bed. The next morning, when Almanzo started to do the chores, Lucy was standing in the yard. Her tail hung limp and her head hung down. She did not squeal when she saw him. She shook her head sadly and wrinkled her nose. Lucy's teeth were stuck together with the candy. She could not eat. She could not drink. She could not even squeal. She could not grunt. But when she saw Almanzo coming, she ran. Almanzo yelled for Royal, and they chased Lucy all around the house, under the snowball bushes and in the lilacs. They chased her all over the garden. Lucy whirled and dodged and ducked and ran like anything. All the time, she didn't make a sound. She couldn't. Her mouth was full of candy. She ran between Royal's legs and upset him. Almanzo almost grabbed her and went sprawling on his nose. She tore through the peas and squashed the ripe tomatoes and uprooted the green round cabbages. Eliza Jane kept telling Royal and Almanzo to catch her. Alice ran after her. At last they cornered her, and she dashed around Alice's skirts. Almanzo fell on her and grabbed. She kicked and tore a long hole down the front of his blouse. Almanzo held her down. Alice held her kicking hind legs. Royal pried her mouth open and scraped out the candy. Then, how Lucy squealed. She squealed all the squeals that had been in her all night, and all the squeals that she couldn't squeal while they were chasing her, and she ran screaming to her pen. Almanzo James Wilder, just look at yourself, Eliza Jane scolded. He couldn't, and he didn't want to. Even Alice was horrified because he had wasted candy on a pig, and his blouse was ruined. It couldn't be patched. It could be patched, but the patch would show. I don't care, Almanzo said. He was glad it was a whole week before Mother would know. That day, they made ice cream again, and they ate the last cake. Alice said she knew how to make a pound cake. She said she'd make one, and then she was going to sit in the parlor. Almanzo thought it wouldn't be any fun, but Eliza Jane said, "You'll do no such thing, Alice. You know very well the parlor's just for company." Well, it was not Eliza Jane's parlor, and Mother hadn't said she couldn't sit in it. Almanzo thought that Alice could sit in the parlor if she wanted to. That afternoon, he came into the kitchen to see if the pound cake was done. Alice was taking it out of the oven. It smelled so good that he broke a little piece off the corner, and then Alice cut a slice to hide the broken place, and then they ate 2 more slices with the last of the ice cream. I can make more ice cream, Alice said. Eliza Jane was upstairs, and Almanzo said, "Let's go in the parlor." And they tiptoed in without making a sound. The light was dim because the blinds were down, but the parlor was beautiful. The wallpaper was white and gold, and the carpet was of Mother's best weaving, almost too fine to step on. The center table was marble-topped, and it held the tall parlor lamp, all white and gold china and pink-painted roses. Beside it lay the photograph album with covers of red velvet and mother of pearl. All around the walls stood solemn horsehair chairs, and George Washington's picture looked down sternly from its frame between the windows. Alice hitched up her hoops behind and sat on the sofa. The slippery horsehair slid her right off onto the floor. She didn't dare laugh out loud for fear Eliza Jane would hear. And she sat on the sofa again and slid off. And then Almanzo slid off a chair. When company came, they had to sit in the parlor, and they kept themselves on the slippery chairs by pushing their toes against the floor. Now they could let go and slide. They slid off the chairs and the sofa until Alice was giggling so hard they didn't dare slide anymore. They looked at the shells and the coral and the little china figures and the whatnot, and they didn't touch anything. They all looked until Eliza Jane coming downstairs. They heard Eliza Jane coming downstairs, and then they ran tiptoe out of the parlor and shut the door without a sound. Eliza Jane didn't catch them. It seemed that a week would last forever, but suddenly it was gone. One morning at breakfast, Eliza Jane said, "Father and Mother will be here tomorrow." And they all stopped eating. The garden had not been weeded. The peas and beans had not been picked. The vines were ripening too soon, and the hen house had not been whitewashed. "This house is a sight," Eliza Jane said, "and we must churn today. But what am I going to tell Mother?" "The sugar is all gone." Nobody ate any more. They looked down in the sugar barrel, and they could see the bottom of it. Only Alice tried to be cheerful. "Oh, we must hope for the best," she said. "Like Mother said, there's some sugar left. Mother said don't eat all the sugar, and we didn't. There's still some around the edges." It was only the beginning of that awful day. They all went to work as hard as they could. Royal and Almanzo hoed the garden. They whitewashed the hen houses. They cleaned the cow stalls, and they swept the south barn floor. The girls were sweeping and scrubbing in the house. Eliza Jane made Almanzo churn until the butter came, and her hands flew while she washed and salted it and packed it in the tub. There was only bread and butter and jam for dinner, although Almanzo was starved. "Now, Almanzo, you polish the heater," Eliza Jane said. He hated to polish stoves, but he hoped Eliza Jane would not tell that he had wasted candy on a pig. He went to work on the stove blacking with the brush, but Eliza Jane was hurrying and nagging. "Be careful you don't spill the polish," she said, busily dusting. Almanzo guessed he knew enough not to spill stove polish, but he didn't say anything. "Use less water, Almanzo." "Oh, and mercy, rub harder than that." And he didn't say anything. "Use less water, Almanzo." Eliza Jane came into the parlor to dust it, and she called, "Almanzo, that stove done now?" "No," said Almanzo. "Goodness, don't dawdle so," Almanzo muttered. "Whose boss are you?" Eliza Jane said, "What's that you say?" "Nothing," said Almanzo. Eliza Jane came to the door. "You did so say something." Almanzo straightened up and shouted, "I say, whose boss are you?" Eliza Jane gasped. She cried out, "You just wait, Almanzo James Wilder. You wait till I tell Almanzo didn't mean to throw the blacking brush. It flew right out of his hand. It sailed past Eliza Jane's head. Smack! It hit the parlor wall. A great splash and smear of blacking appeared on the white and gold wallpaper. Alice screamed. Almanzo turned around and ran all the way to the barn. He climbed to the haymow and crawled far back in the hay. He did not cry, but he would have cried if he hadn't been almost 10 years old.